Hello, this is the Aussie Arrowhead. What you are listening to is part of a series where I read from the book What the Buddha Taught by Walpola Rahula and make some personal commentaries. The Buddhist attitude of mind continued. Rahula talks about doubt and sin. According to the Buddha, doubt is one of the 5 hindrances and is a barrier to both the clear understanding of truth and to making spiritual progress. Rahula brings up sin to illustrate a point about Buddhism. Although regarded as a hindrance to enlightenment, doubt is not a sin. There is no concept of sin in Buddhism, as it is understood in some religions. But there is a root to all evil, in Rahula's words, and that is ignorance and false views. Avidya, ignorance, is the root cause of dukkha, the first noble truth, which states that life is often experienced as suffering. If you remove the fuel of ignorance, the fire of dukkha is extinguished. To remove the fuel of ignorance, we cultivate right view, the first step in the Eightfold Path, which is to see things clearly as they are. Rahula continues, it is undeniable that as long as there is doubt, perplexity, or wavering, no progress is possible. It is also undeniable that there is doubt if one does not understand or see clearly. In order to progress further, one must get rid of doubt, and to get rid of doubt, one has to see clearly. We must resolve our doubt. Rahula compares doubt to a student solving a mathematical puzzle. At a certain point, when solving a math problem, we come to a stage where doubt and perplexity set in. As long as we have this doubt, we cannot proceed. But what we can do is find a way to resolve doubt. Rahula makes the following statement, quote, to force oneself to believe and to accept a thing without understanding is political and not spiritual or intellectual, unquote. It is unclear to me exactly what he means by this, but I think he is saying that blind faith is a political decision, and that if you accept beliefs in blind faith, you are aligned with a faction or position, and you are more concerned with that than you are with developing spiritually and investigating the truth. The word political is so loaded, though, that I think he could have expressed this in a different way. Rahula tells us that just before the Buddha died, he requested his disciples to ask him if they had any doubts about his teachings, and reassured them it was okay if they could not clear those doubts. The disciples remained silent. The Buddha further reassured them that if it was out of respect for their teacher they did not speak, they could ask another disciple to speak on their behalf. Rahula found this moment touching, but doesn't explain why. It seems to me it is because this act by the Buddha showed an unusual humility towards his disciples who regarded him as a great teacher, and that the Buddha's concerns on his deathbed were not about his authority and his legacy. They were about showing compassion towards and clarifying teachings for his students. Rahula moves on. He praises the Buddha's tolerance and states that the Buddha's tolerance is astonishing to any student of the history of religions. Rahula tells a story, quote, once in Nalanda, a prominent and wealthy householder named Upali, a well-known lay disciple of Nagantha Nataputta, who is the Jain teacher Mahavira, was expressly sent by Mahavira himself to meet the Buddha and defeat him in argument on certain points in the theory of karma, because the Buddha's views on the subject were different from those of Mahavira. Quite contrary to expectations, Upali, at the end of the discussion, was convinced that the views of the Buddha were right and those of his master were wrong. So he begged the Buddha to accept him as one of his lay disciples. But the Buddha asked Upali to reconsider and not be in a hurry, for considering carefully is good for well-known men like you. When Upali expressed his desire again, The Buddha requested him to continue to respect and support his old religious teachers as he used to. End quote. In this story, Mahavira is made out to be a bit of a competitive jerk, while the Buddha responds to Upali's challenge in a way that is non-dogmatic, fair, and respectful. This story is found in the Upali Sutra, which is part of a number of conversion stories involving the Buddha. These include discussions with the murderer Angulimala, the demon Alavaka, Ambapali the courtesan, and a low-caste woman named Prakti. In another story, Kisa Gautami, a mother grieving the loss of her child, approaches the Buddha and asks the Buddha for a medicine to bring her son back to life. The Buddha gave her a task: locate a mustard seed from a house where nobody has died. After going from door to door, she learned everybody knew someone who had passed away. This was intended to be a lesson on impermanence. These stories highlight the Buddha's use of upaya kushalya, skillful means, to guide people towards enlightenment. This is a technique of teaching which adapts to the situation and the learner's ability to understand, but also it may stop short of explaining the ultimate truth, paramatta sakha, and translating it in a way the student can understand. In the case of the Upali story, the Buddha's upaya could be said to be his behavioural approach. By refusing to act like a typical guru hungry for followers, Upali was drawn to the Buddha and felt it spoke highly of the Buddha as a teacher. Rahula talks about the Buddhist emperor Ashoka of India, who lived in the 3rd century BC. Ashoka followed the Buddha's example of tolerance and understanding, honouring and supporting other religions in his empire. In an edict carved on rock, the emperor declared, quote, "One should not honour only one's religion and condemn the religions of others, but one should honour other religions for this or that reason. So doing, one helps one's own religion to grow and renders service to the religions of others too. In acting otherwise, one digs the grave of one's own religion and also does harm to other religions. Whosoever honours his own religion and condemns others' religions does so indeed through devotion to his own religion, thinking, 'I will glorify my own religion.' But on the contrary, in doing so he injures his own religion more gravely. So concord is good. Let all listen, and be willing to listen to the doctrines professed by others." Unquote. Rahula believes this spirit of sympathetic understanding should be practiced today, and that this spirit of tolerance is one of the most cherished tools of Buddhism and civilization. He then claims this is why, when it comes to converting people, there is not a single example of persecution or the shedding of a drop of blood in the entire history of Buddhism. Buddhism spread peacefully across Asia, having 500 million adherents in 1959 by the time Rahula published the book. Rahula states, quote, "Violence in any form, under any pretext whatsoever, is absolutely against the teaching of the Buddha." Unquote. Emperor Ashoka was the emperor of Magadha, an ancient Indian empire from circa 268 BCE until his death. Before converting to Buddhism, Ashoka was a violent and sadistic ruler who was known as Shandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. He was known for the Kalinga War, a bloody invasion of the kingdom of Kalinga. There are several legends about his astonishing cruelty, including one where he built a famous torture chamber known as Ashoka's Hell. What we do know is that after witnessing the bloodshed against the Kalingas, Ashoka converted to Buddhism. Across the continent of India, a series of monolithic columns known as the Pillars of Ashoka can be found. On these, Ashoka wrote a number of edicts, which serve as some of the earliest evidence of Buddhism. On the 13th rock edict, the following inscription can be found. Quote, "Beloved of the gods, King Priyadasi, Ashoka, conquered the Kalingans 8 years after his coronation. 150,000 were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many more died from other causes. After the Kalingans had been conquered, beloved of the gods came to feel a strong inclination towards the Dharma, a love for the Dharma and for instruction in Dharma. Now beloved of the gods feels deep remorse for having conquered the Kalingans." Unquote. Emperor Ashoka embraced the Dharma. He became a major patron of the Buddhist religion, helping spread it across Asia. As a Buddhist, he embraced ahimsa, non-violence, and was one of the earliest advocates of religious pluralism. Ashoka holds a reputation as one of India's greatest emperors. A symbol which appeared on his stone edicts, the Ashoka chakra, can be found on the Indian flag. It is important to note that when Rahula says there has never been a single example of persecution or the shedding of a drop of blood in the entire history of Buddhism, that he is talking about converting people, and does not mean there has never been Buddhist violence. There have been many Buddhist kingdoms and countries, and Buddhist leaders, including Ashoka, have committed violence over standard geopolitical struggles involving territory, resources, and survival. Rahula is correct that violence of any kind is against the teachings of the Buddha, and that examples of Buddhist violence are rare, but there is one notable exception I should mention, and that is how in World War II, Buddhism was used to justify Japanese imperialism and militarism. This was a complex situation, but in summary, Buddhist leaders and institutions not only supported, but provided an ideological framework and moral mandate for Japan's wartime policies, with Zen recognised as a tool which can turn Japanese soldiers into killing machines, anatta or no self interpreted as submission to the emperor, and the Bodhisattva interpreted as someone who may invade other lands to spread Buddhism and compassionately kill. Rahula's omission of this is striking. I do not know if he has made commentaries on Japanese Buddhism during World War II elsewhere, but his claim that there is not a shedding of a drop of blood in the entire history of Buddhism is false. The book was written in 1959, after World War II ended. In Rahula's defence, the scholarship on this wasn't quite there. It wasn't until Zen at War was published in 1997 we'd have a more widely known, comprehensive account of Japanese Buddhism during this time period. But also, Rahula was a Buddhist modernist, and his project in this book is to sell Buddhism to Western readers. About this, I have two thoughts. One is that omitting Buddhism in Japan during World War II may be a strategic silence. Rahula is either using upaya kushalya, skillful means, just like the Buddha did, to bring the reader close to enlightenment, or is lying through omission and half-truths, depending on who you ask. In this picture, what the Buddha taught is intentionally curated to present Buddhism as a religion of peace and reason, in contrast with the perceived irrationality of the world wars and the growing threat of the nuclear Cold War, and Buddhism in Japan during World War II is inconvenient to this. The second is that Rahula may simply be engaging in a no true Scotsman kind of fallacy, where Buddhism wedded to nationalism and imperialism is not real Buddhism. To his credit, the book is about what the Buddha taught, and what the Buddha taught was non-violence and freedom of inquiry, not compassionate killing and submission to authority.